Welcome to Renegade Inc. In his 1967 book, it was Dr. Martin Luther King who posed the question, where do we go from here, chaos or community? Having changed America and the world with a civil rights movement, he then turned his attention to economics. Heavily influenced by the political economist Henry George, Dr. King concluded that if the economics in America were not addressed, then chaos would rip communities apart. Just over 50 years later, it looks like Martin Luther King was correct. We went to Newark, New Jersey, to speak with community organizer and civil rights activist Larry Hamm. He has dedicated his life to social and economic justice and sees 2020 as a pivotal moment in American history. Larry, we sit here 2020, you've got an election coming up, and anybody watching looks at America and you can't help but think this is a country at a huge crossroads.
Yes.
What are the options?
Well, quite frankly, the way I see it, it's a choice between democracy and fascism. I think the election of Donald Trump signaled, I wouldn't necessarily call it a resurgence because they've always been here, but signaled the rise of an even more strengthened right-wing and dangerous and violent movement in this country. And all of those sections came together to support Donald Trump. I mean, Trump, of course, he got many different kinds of endorsements, but among those endorsements were the Ku Klux Klan, who openly endorsed him, and the 330,000 member Fraternal Order of Police. So the police and the Klan endorsed Trump and so many other right-wing groups. And I think his election showed that this whole section is on the rise, and it's very dangerous because in the aftermath of Trump, we've had an increase. I mean, we always had racist violence in this country, but we've had an increase in racist violence, racist attacks, people going into churches, killing people, going into mosques, killing people, going into synagogues, killing people, going into Walmart with AR-15 rifles and killing 20, 30 people at a time. It's a very dangerous situation, and I think that America is at the crossroads. I think the re-election of Trump would strengthen even more this dangerous ultra-right-wing tendency in this country, this neo-fascist movement in this country, and I think it's a choice. That's why I think Trump has to be defeated, not because I think that it will bring about any transformation of the economic system or the political system, but a victory for him will only strengthen that dangerous rightward trend.
And who's the person to defeat him?
I think the person best suited for the job is Bernie Sanders. I supported Bernie Sanders in 2016. I was a delegate for Bernie Sanders to the Democratic National Convention. I'm supporting Bernie Sanders in 2020. And right now, I am the state chairman of the Bernie Sanders campaign here in New Jersey, and I think he is the best candidate. And I think he's the best candidate not only because the polls show that he can defeat Trump, but because he is the candidate that wants to, in fact, change the whole damn system.
And in the last election, was he robbed with the Hillary?
I absolutely believed he was robbed of the nomination. I think the effort from the beginning, once he announced and once it became clear that he had popular support, the effort was to, in fact, rob him of the nomination. And I think they will try and do it again.
Right. What is the establishment here in the US so scared of? Why is there such a visceral reaction to Bernie Sanders?
Because, first of all, they definitely don't want a socialist movement in this country.
Right.
That's thing one. But thing two is they don't want even the initial reforms that Sanders is talking about. Medicare for all is not socialism, but it's a better alternative to what we have now with millions of people without health care in this country, with privatized health care. So they don't want either the reforms that Sanders is talking about in the immediate, and they definitely don't want a popular socialist movement. Like, there are people in the United States now that say they are democratic socialists and socialists of various stripes, but that has not congealed into a major popular movement. But Sanders, if he has done anything, he has shown, in fact, that there's a wide swath of the American population who gravitate toward his ideas and who want to see a fundamental change in our social system.
Do you agree with him when he says that every billionaire is a policy mistake?
I don't know about a policy mistake, but I think a social system, an economic system that produces billionaires and millionaires at this level is a social system that's antithetical to the interests of the majority of the people, because you can't have wealth without poverty. And you can't have extreme wealth without extreme poverty. Billionaires are not accidents. They are the product of a particular type of economic system, and that economic system is the capitalist economic system. Every institution in this society, all of the major institutions, are geared up to work in tandem to support this popular mythology, this Horatio Alger story, this idea that everybody can be a millionaire, that you can walk in your corner store and buy a lottery ticket and you too can become a millionaire.
But it's bigger than that, isn't it? Because people go to work day in, day out.
Right.
Yet the economy's working against them because you've got trickle up economics. You certainly haven't got trickle down.
Right.
Wall Street, by using financial capitalism, has hollowed out the productive economy, the real economy.
Yes.
Yet people still seem blinded to it. And whenever you mention the S word, they say, well, no.
That's absolutely correct.
But so
because they have a false consciousness, a consciousness that is instilled in them from the time that they are babies and children, and it keeps going until they become adults. I mean, this false consciousness is what we learn in school.
And what is it, if you were to define it? What is that false consciousness?
Well, the false consciousness is a belief in the capitalist system, that this is the best of all possible worlds and any other world is inferior to this.
These people have never been to Scandinavia.
They don't know about Scandinavia, and if you say democratic socialism or social democracy or any kind of thing, immediately they're going to cringe, as I did.
Why?
When I was a kid.
Right.
Because we were taught that socialism was bad.
So how did you...
Socialism, communism, bad. Don't believe in that stuff.
So how did you break free then mentally?
Well, I broke free because of a combination of both objective and subjective conditions. Objectively, I was probably in the dark until I was about 12 years old, and the Newark Rebellion, what we call rebellion, the history books call it riots, broke out in 1967. There were riots all over America. In fact, if you read the history, you'll see that between 1960 and 1972, there were over 1,000 uprisings in cities and towns all across America. And one of the biggest and most remembered was the Newark Rebellion of 1967. And I came from a poor black family, a working class black family, but we, believe it or not, we didn't, back then in the 50s and early, we didn't talk much about race, or at least as a kid, they didn't talk much about race to me. But when literally the rebellion was happening all around our house, in the street that our house was on, I had to ask my mother and my grandfather, my father was then deceased, why are people so angry? And then that was really the beginning for me. And then when I got to high school, there was controversy about the Vietnam War. Literally, my student orientation at Arts High School, the student government president was asked by the principal to get up to speak. The student government president goes to the podium and starts talking about the war in Vietnam. The student government president and the principal get into a fight on stage. I'm 13 years old. I'm sitting in the audience with my mouth open, not knowing what the hell he was talking about. But I knew that this must be important because he felt so strongly about it that he would challenge the principal. And so these things kept happening objectively. And then subjectively, I was exposed to certain things. Like in my senior year in high school, I had a humanities class where we began to read the works of James Baldwin and other black authors. So it was a combination of events, conditions, things that I was exposed to that helped change my consciousness. And you know, that has continued throughout my life and brought me to where I am today. But most people, you know, they're still under the burden of that false consciousness, even among African Americans, you know, that somehow capitalism can save us. You can see it during the Democratic debates that the black candidates are still putting forward these ideas and these proposals within the system. I'll be 66 next month. And at this point, I have to make an assessment. And the assessment is that everything we've tried up to this point is not working, because black people in this country are actually in worse shape today than we were in 1968 when Dr. King was assassinated. The paradigm of this consciousness is episodic, and we think that these things have just started, but they haven't. Class warfare has been going on in this country since the country was founded. Now, it ebbs and it flows. It goes up, it goes down. The last really serious class conflict we had was probably during the Depression. And what's been going on since the New Deal has been an effort to turn everything, not just the gains that black people have made, but the gains that everybody have made for the last 75 to 100 years. I mean, think about it. In this country, after World War II, almost half of labor in America was unionized. Today, less than 10% of labor. Now, is that an accident? No, it's not an accident, because they have made efforts, legal efforts and all other kinds of efforts, to stifle the union movement in this country. So these things just didn't begin, but they ebb and they flow over time.
So when the poster boy for financial capitalism, Warren Buffett, says there is a class war on, and guess what? My class are winning.
That's right.
You're not shocked by that?
I'm not shocked.
In fact, he's refreshingly honest.
Right, he's honest. And at the same time, some of these people understand that if they continue down this path, it's going to lead to an environment where they can't make any money. So they would rather make concessions and keep the system going than to keep things bottled up and have it explode. Because if it explodes, then there's a possibility that the system can't function or that it may collapse. So those who can see beyond their own self-interest are able to make utterances like Warren Buffett. And it wouldn't be the first time. All through history, there have been people in the upper classes who understood that the current social arrangement is not healthy for everybody, you know, and so they comment on it. But at the same time, you have those who would hang themselves in an effort to keep making money.
In that first half, we talked about when you were 12 years old, suddenly the lights start to go on. You ask your mother and grandfather, what's going on? Why is this rebellion happening? And why is it happening here? Because ordinarily these things happen in other places, faraway lands. And then through education, you're thinking differently, you're watching the social fabric, the ebb and the flow. And then eventually you go to Princeton.
Undergraduate, graduate, and then
you come back to Newark. You come back to the place that where it all started. Just talk a bit about that and why you deliberately came back to that bit of the world.
I wasn't born in Newark. I was actually born in Washington, D.C. But I was brought to Newark as a babe, almost as a newborn. So
but it's
my home. It's my home. And I always felt connected. And I wasn't a particularly politically active youth, unlike my peers. Believe it or not, when I was in high school, I had peers that worked in the election of Ken Gibson, who was the first black mayor of the city of Newark. I was an average kind of high school student. I ran track. I wanted to graduate. I wanted to go to college. I wanted to have a girlfriend, you know, just like everybody else. But the rebellion happened. That happened like right at the beginning of my high school experience. And then in 1971, that's when I became a student activist. There had been a teacher strike in Newark in 1971, and the law was that if we missed 35 consecutive days of school, we weren't going to graduate. I happened to be the student government president at my high school at that time, and I led my first walkout in March of 1971 when I was a senior in high school, and we ended up taking over this building right here. We took over 2 floors of this building, the Gateway Hotel. It was the Hilton Gateway at that time, and that's where the Board of Education and the union were down here negotiating. We sat in down here in 1971. I thought I was going to get thrown out of school. My principal told me I was going to get thrown out of school. The end result was at 17, I was appointed to the Newark Board of Education being the youngest fully voting school board member in the history of the United States. And I think that's still true.
Right.
At that time, I was scheduled to go to Princeton, to start at Princeton University, which I did, but my duties as a board member was so much that I couldn't do Princeton and do the board too. So I left Princeton and became essentially a full-time school board member, and actually continued as a student organizer, because it was the student movement that brought me to power. When I finished my school board term, I ran for city council here in Newark at the age of 20. I think I'm still the youngest person to ever run for city council in Newark. That didn't work out. I didn't win the election. Then I went to Princeton University, went back to Princeton.
But even at that time, you were really instrumental in boycotting the apartheid regime in South Africa.
That's right.
And you were very, very vocal about it when people weren't.
Yes.
And you led those boycotts.
Yes. In Princeton, with other students, I formed the People's Front for the Liberation of Southern Africa. That's what we called it. To get Princeton to divest its holdings in companies that did business that supported the apartheid regime. And we had many demonstrations and protests, and that led to a takeover of the University Administration Building in 1978. And Princeton did divest from several companies. They didn't do a complete divestment, but they divested from a few of the corporations. When I finished at Princeton, I returned to Newark because over those years from high school through college, I saw the importance of community organizing. I saw that we needed to build a movement for social transformation. It was at Princeton that I was exposed to the ideas of everybody from Martin Luther King to Karl Marx, and studied revolutions of all types. And I wanted to come back home and build the movement. I returned to Newark in 1980. And by 1983 had formed the People's Organization for Progress, which I am the chairman of, and we've just observed our 36th anniversary. And I've been on that path ever since. And I think the task that faces us, probably the project that I'm going to be working on until I leave the planet, and that's going to be to build a movement, or be part of building a movement that can fundamentally transform our social and economic system. I believe that Martin Luther King was right when he wrote his book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community, in 1966. In that chapter called The World House, in that book, he said, we need a radical redistribution of power and wealth in America. He said we need a fundamental transformation of our socioeconomic system. That's a quote from Martin Luther King. Those are not the I have a dream quotes we hear all the time. But I think that's what Dr. King really was about, and I want to continue that effort.
When Dr. King started talking about economics, the economy, people had obviously seen how effective he'd been in the other aspects of social reform. Did that absolutely terrify the establishment?
I think it did. I think that's why he was assassinated. I think he was assassinated for two reasons, and both of them fundamentally were economic. One, he opposed the war in Vietnam. Now, he had wrestled with opposing. He'd been thinking about it for a long time because he had people pushing him. People like Stokely Carmichael, later known as Kwame Ture, and many of the brothers and sisters from SNCC as early as 1963. Because John Lewis, when he spoke at the same march that Dr. King spoke at and gave the I Have a Dream speech, John Lewis was going to talk about Vietnam, but they edited Vietnam out of his speech. So the SNCC people had been pushing Dr. King, and then finally Dr. King gave that speech. People call it the Why I Oppose the War in Vietnam speech, but its actual title is A Time to Break the Silence. Because Dr. King had been silent. He had been part of an arrangement not to talk about the war, and LBJ would get the Civil Rights Bill through. But as a man of conscience, he couldn't not talk, and ultimately he had to break that silence. So that was thing one. Thing two was the Poor People's Campaign. In his book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community, Dr. King said that he wanted to bring 1 million people to Washington, D.C. to engage in massive nonviolent civil disobedience until the Congress passed an economic Bill of Rights. Living wage for all, a guaranteed income, education for all, universal health care. All of these things were part of his economic Bill of Rights in 1968. And I think because of the war in Vietnam, the Poor People's Campaign, those two things were the reasons that they would assassinate him. And it wasn't just the effort. There were several attempts to kill Dr. King. They feared King because they thought that he might be the one that could not only unify the black movement, but bring the black movement, the anti-war movement together, to bring that real kind of people's rainbow coalition together, and that would lead a movement to change the system.
But we sit here now, 2020, and you're asking exactly the same question.
Right.
Chaos or community?
Right.
An election coming up, all that simmering tension is just under the surface.
Yes.
And what we talked about in that first half with
Yes.
the Trumpian supporters. Sanders over here trying to unify, but ultimately those economic questions haven't gone away.
No, they haven't gone away because...
In fact, if anything, they've intensified.
Absolutely.
And maybe Dr. King could see that that's where that was headed.
Oh, absolutely, he could see it. And this is not by accident where we are here today.
Right.
And it's not just because of whatever shortcomings we might have as organizers and people on the left,
So what
to
is it?
speak. The system has been at war with us. They have been at war with us since 1968. It's not just that we push forward, it's that they push back. And they've been pushing back with all of their might since 1968, since the election of Richard Nixon, since 1968, for 48 years. They have been overtly and covertly engaged in trying to destroy any movement that could shake this system at its foundations.
Why, when Barack Obama then was elected, and it seemed to be a break in the clouds, a brave new world, a new dawn, why is he still so popular in this country when he was so very conventional?
The short answer is that he was the first black president. And racism is such a gigantic problem in this country that just the fact that he could get elected, just the fact that he was the first one to get elected, has given him a special place in the hearts and minds of many people. And it makes it very difficult for them to assess him in a critical way. Now, in the interest of full disclosure, I voted for Barack Obama. I voted for him in 2008, and I voted for him in 2012. Both times I voted for him. But because I voted for him, that didn't mean I turned off whatever critical faculties I had. You can support somebody for whatever good things they might be doing and remain critical of whatever bad things that they might be doing. Some people are supportive, some people oppose them, and these are among the people that voted for him.
But Cornel West, your friend, he's been a very vocal
He's
critic.
been very critical. In
But
fact,
he puts his critique right in the middle of neoliberalism and says that
Right.
this guy was a arch neoliberal, and his big gripe not only was the terrible foreign policy mistakes that Mr. Obama made, but also the fact that he bailed out Wall Street and he threw Main Street to the wolves.
That's right. That's why the system has been so hard on Brother Cornel West. They went after Cornel and after Tavis Smiley because those were two credible black voices, not just two black voices, because there are a lot of voices out who were criticizing Obama. But those were two credible black voices that said that the Obama administration was not addressing the issue of poverty in the United States. And that was true. But unfortunately, you know, a lot of people can't see the forest for the trees, so to speak. But I will say this. I think recently, former President Obama cautioned people in the Democratic Party about moving too far to the left. And I think that hurt him. I think that hurt him.
Did the mask slip?
I think the mask did slip, and I think enough people have been catching hell, so much hell in the last 4 years, that they're like, well, you know, dear Mr. President, please sit down. You know, you had your chance, now let us do this, because people want real change.
Right.
They don't just want to change the governor from white to black, the president from white to black. People want real change. They want their children to go to college without having to mortgage their homes 2 and 3 times or even sell their homes to send their kids to college. They want to work 40 hours a week and make enough money to not have to work a second job or
take on huge amounts of debt.
Or take on huge amounts of debt. You know, they want to be able to go to the doctor without worrying about, are they going to be able to pay the doctor bill? They want a better life.
So when Bernie Sanders says, are you willing to go out and fight for somebody that you don't know? What does that say to you?
Well, I think what Bernie Sanders is trying to do is get to the heart of the matter, not only critique the system, but it's also a challenge to us. You know, what is required to change the system? It's requiring a change within us. Are you willing? Do you believe in this so much that you're willing to fight for someone whose name you don't even know, whose face you can't even see? Because in the final analysis, it takes that kind of selflessness to bring about fundamental social change. My belief is that the kind of change we need is not going to come from someone in the White House.
Right.
It's going to come from millions of average people who don't really have any stake, in trying to keep things the way they are, to come together to make that kind of change.
Back to your community organizing.
Right. Community organizing is very important.
Are you excited?
I've worked like other people work a regular job, and now I'm at the point that I can retire and spend the majority of my time actually trying to realize those ideas that I'm talking to you about. That part is exciting. What's a little disheartening is that after 66 years, the same social paradigm exists. There might be a few more rungs on the ladder, but it's a ladder nonetheless. We still have so much work to do. That's a little disheartening, but every time I see some small victory, some fight around police brutality where the people won and the police actually did get convicted and got a sentence commensurate with the crime that they committed, that gives me new hope. Every time I see the thousands of people that come out, like I was with Bernie Sanders at his rally recently in New York City, where they said there were over 25,000 people that came out for a campaign rally. I mean, just being there. I mean, I didn't speak that day. I was just another face in the crowd, but just being there energized me, So these things that happen along the way, they're like recharging, like charging your phone. I get recharged, so I can keep going. But it's gonna be a fight. It's gonna be a fight, and it's not gonna be easy. But I think ultimately we will win. I believe that.
Larry Hamm, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. All right.